open your Bible with me, if you would, to Daniel chapter 6. I have so much enjoyed this study, and it's been so rich in examples of a believer, an example of one serving the Lord. And Daniel 6, I couldn't go through this quickly. It's such a remarkable example. And again, we're not trying to set the bar high in order to win points with God. We're not striving to earn our salvation by doing certain things. But those that are saved and followers of God, followers of Christ, they want to live for Him and honor Him. And Daniel's life is extraordinarily full of examples. Remember, when the Babylonian Empire took over the remaining kingdom of Israel, Judah, and when the Babylonian Empire took that over, the southern kingdom, many of the people were exiled into captivity, and some of the young men, usually teenagers, and I suppose women as well, I'm not sure, but usually teenagers were put into what essentially was a reprogramming school, a time that lasted 3 years. They would change their names to Chaldean names. They would teach them Chaldean sciences, Chaldean religion. They would do everything that they could do to indoctrinate them, and they would pick the best and the brightest of the Hebrew children intentionally and then re-educate them and put them in positions of leadership to help soothe relationships between the Hebrew people and the Chaldean people. And Daniel was one of them. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're mostly known by their Chaldean names. Daniel, I think it's interesting that his name remained for the most part through this book as Daniel, his Hebrew name. And I think that is remarkable in the sense that all of the reprogramming and the 70 years in captivity under various pagan kings, they couldn't change him from being a follower of Jehovah. They couldn't change the Hebrewness of Daniel. And they tried. And he excelled in Nebuchadnezzar's cabinet, probably what we would think of as prime minister, second in charge in Nebuchadnezzar's cabinet, and had such a remarkable influence on Nebuchadnezzar, eventually even seeing Nebuchadnezzar saved and converted to the Lord, and writing edicts about how that no one can publicly defame the name of God. And Daniel was right there in that cabinet. Of course, he was promoted to third in charge in Belshazzar's cabinet for a day. And then Belshazzar was killed that night, and the Medes came in and took over. And that's where we pick up the story now. Daniel's integrity preceded him. Daniel's reputation preceded him. And Darius of the Medes, who took over the Babylonian Empire, Darius sets Daniel high in his cabinet. And this is so interesting, and it's so telling on real ministry. We think real ministry is missionaries. We think real ministry is full-time preaching ministry somewhere. We think real ministry is some kind of full-time Christian service. Real ministry is wherever God has you. Real ministry is where you're working. Wherever He has you, whatever realm of influence He has you in. If He has you raising children, Your ministry is raising children. If He has you working, your ministry is working. If He has you in this place or that place, whatever that is, it doesn't have to be a missionary on foreign soil. Daniel was serving at the pleasure of pagan kings nearly his entire life. And they never changed him. They never stopped calling him by his Hebrew name, Daniel. Once in a while it would creep in, but it'll even show up again here tonight. Now Daniel at this point in Daniel 6 is 85 years old or so. He's been in captivity the majority of his life, being exiled over probably when he was in his mid-teens. And so now, I mean, he's 85, right? You kick it in neutral and go fishing. You kick it in neutral and buy a recreational camel and go hit the trail and just enjoy my sunset years. Daniel's doing none of those things. He's just simply serving the Lord where the Lord has him. And it's just incredible to see his testimony. We'll see him elevated in Darius's cabinet. And we'll see him faithful to pagan, yet another pagan king. But not more faithful to the king than God, right? That's what gets him in trouble in Daniel chapter 6. And I believe there's a reason why Daniel was so faithful. Let's read the first 3 verses of Daniel chapter 6, and then I want to take you back to Jeremiah and tie some context together. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes. So the kingdom is divided up with 120 princes that are over various regions of the kingdom. Which 120 princes which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents. So over that 120, there was the next stage in the corporate ladder, in the political ladder in this case, were 3 that were over the 120. And those 3 then would answer to the king. But the king, let's read this, verse 2. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts to them. So all of the 120 would give account to the 3, that the king should have no damage. You need to understand that the king should have no damage. If you and I that are working and employed, we want to take that to heart, that the king would have no damage. There should be no diminishing in the king in any way. There should be no diminishing in the king in reputation. There should be no diminishing in the king in monetary loss. There should be no diminishing the king in political advantage. Their job was to promote the king, that he should have no damage. And that's something that the Lord impressed upon me years ago, that when I served a certain boss, and whatever boss that it was, and I began to say this a lot to one of my bosses, my job, as I see it, is to make you look good. And that's the idea of that the king should have no damage. My job is to make the boss look good. Your job is to make the boss look good. That's a part of a good testimony. You're not, talking about the boss behind his back and whispering things that tear him down and undermine his authority and undermine his reputation and undermine him in the corporate structure. No, none of those things. And Daniel's job as one of these 3 was that the king might have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. there was going to be one on top of the three that were on top of the 120, and that was going to be Daniel. Because he had an excellent spirit. Think about an excellent spirit. A good attitude in 70 years of captivity. An excellent spirit in the better part of 70 years serving pagan kings. An excellent spirit in 70 years of a pagan environment where they even try to scrub his Hebrew history. And in that 70 years, he is seen consistent with an excellent spirit. He has a good attitude. He has a good reputation. He has a part of that excellent spirit is his godly wisdom, his godly knowledge. And he puts that to practice. He puts biblical principles into practice in his daily life, and the kings love it. Nebuchadnezzar did. Belshazzar would have, had he lived long enough to enjoy it. And Darius did. Darius hadn't been with him nearly as long as Nebuchadnezzar, but his reputation was there, and as Darius looked on to Daniel's life, he's like, wow, this guy's got it. And he's looking out for me. He's serving his God. I don't care what God he serves. As long as he acts like that, as long as he has that kind of wisdom and knowledge, as long as he treats me like he treats me, as long as he makes sure that I have no damage like he does, I don't care if he serves a fish. I don't care who he bows to. But Daniel is bowing to Jehovah. Daniel's allegiance is to Jehovah, which doesn't matter that much to Darius, but he likes Daniel. And he likes Daniel a lot. What the Lord brought into my understanding this week, as I thought on this, is that there's some really good reasons, aside from just good character. Daniel was like that, and Jeremiah 29 has some of the answers to that. See, Daniel was faithful to God. Daniel was faithful then, because he was faithful to God, he was faithful to God's word. And in Jeremiah 29, we have a passage starting in verse 1. Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem unto the residue of the elders which were carried away captives, and to the priests and to the prophets and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. So I read verse 1 just simply to set the stage as to what Jeremiah was addressing, and it's addressing the captives that originally were under Nebuchadnezzar, and those that were in exile under Nebuchadnezzar, which Daniel would have been one of the key ones of those. And notice what the Lord said through Jeremiah to the captives that were originally under Nebuchadnezzar, now all the way 70 years later under Darius, king of the Medes. Start with verse 4. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon. So you get the context of all this. God is reminding them, I caused this. And many of the prophets remind them God caused it because the children of Israel earned a spanking, and they were getting one. And so Daniel is being reminded when he reads Jeremiah, this is God's doing. This is of God. And if it's of God, it's right. And if it's of God, it will end good. Verse 11, I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace, not of evil. I'll give you an expected end. I know what I'm doing. And I will bring you out of this. And Daniel is reminded of that as he would read on this letter and think on it. And what does he tell them to do in verses 5 through 7? Build ye houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives and beget sons and daughters. Take ye wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands. And I believe the marital instructions of the Lord would still be as it had been in the Levitical law, to only marry Hebrew children. He's not telling them to marry pagan. But he's telling you, get married, have children, plant gardens, build houses, live in the land. It's going to be 70 years. You're not going to pitch a tent and make it do for 70 years. Make it permanent as our lives are. And let's read on verse 6. There towards the end of it, after the husbands, that they bear sons and daughters, that ye may be increased there and not diminished. God wanted them to flourish as a people, wanted them to learn their lesson. In verse 7 then, and seek the peace of the city. The instructions of God through Jeremiah to the Hebrew children, which Daniel would know this. Daniel would have been a key recipient of this information. Seek the peace of the city. He's not telling them to rebel. He's not telling them to, those Babylonians have put you under their thumb and you rise up and you rebel again. He said, seek the peace. You just live there. I did this. I'm doing this. I have an expected end. You'll come out of the woodshed when I'm ready. Until then, get married, live your lives, have families. Seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof ye shall have peace. So, he's telling them to be good citizens. He's telling them to seek peace, not rile things up. He's telling them, and you see Daniel living it. He seeks not only to be a good citizen, but a faithful servant to the pagan king. In this case, now the third one at least. And history would indicate there's even been a couple in between, but at least the very third one here in Darius. So back to our text in verses 1 through 3, verse 3 especially. Here's this godly man, and again, this excellent spirit, great attitude, really sharp guy, obviously very faithful to the king, even more faithful to the Lord. Just a stand-up guy. And in a remarkably ungodly place. Pagan deities all around him. Pagan religion abounding. All the wizards of smart and the astrologers that we've indicated and ran into in the chapters previous, of all the different sectors, of all the different religious components to the way they would look at spiritual things. And Daniel is not only surviving in this environment, he's thriving as an example. And I believe part of that is that he's read what Jeremiah said. He knows this is the word of the Lord through the pen of Jeremiah. And his instructions are, be good citizens. Our instructions are, be good citizens. His instructions were, seek peace and pray for the country. And our instructions are, seek peace and pray for the country. And he was to shine there. And God help us to shine wherever He has us. Wherever He has us doing. His job was to help the king. His job in the vernacular that the Lord gave me not that long ago, to make my boss look good. And Daniel did a great job of it. And guess what? This godly man, this dear old 85-year-old or so guy, that is this stalwart of the faith, just steady and solid. He's got some enemies in the king's cabinet. Let's look. Verse 4. Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault. I love that. I mean, that encourages me to try harder. These are very advanced individuals. I mean, these are obviously the best of the best in Darius's cabinet. You don't get there, you don't get into Darius's cabinet being a slacker. You don't get into Darius's cabinet without being as sharp as a tack and respectful and all those things. And so these guys are smart. These guys are good at what they do. And they try to find something amiss in Daniel's professional life. How would you like that? More importantly, if somebody starts lifting up the curtains of our professional life, would we come away as Daniel did? They could find no occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful. They couldn't find an email that Daniel sent that was, derogatory towards the king. They couldn't find a text message that he said, the old boy's lost it. We got to figure out something else to do with Darius. There was nothing like that. He was faithful first to God, as we'll see, and then to the king. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. They couldn't find any weak spot in Daniel. They couldn't find any evidence of unfaithfulness to the king, because there wasn't any. They couldn't find any malpractice in any of his business deals or anything else in Daniel's life. They couldn't find anything. Verse 5, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Now I wanted to bring up at the end of verse 4, and I almost forgot. It's interesting to me, they didn't even try to lie. Mommy. I mean, the Pharisees and the Sadducees paid people to lie about the Lord. We read that in the New Testament. In this case, they didn't even try to lie and make a false case against Daniel. And I believe that's because nobody would have believed it anyway. And we're going to run into this in a little bit, that they accused Daniel to the king of having no regard for him. As they did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they accused them to Nebuchadnezzar, they have no regard for you. Nebuchadnezzar never even addressed it. The king here never even will address it. He knows that's not the case. He doesn't even acknowledge that they said it. So they don't even try. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. If there's one thing we figured out in this time that we've worked with him, in his 70 years serving various pagan kings, and now our time together as we've served Darius with him, if there's one thing we know about Daniel, his personal conduct is near perfect. We can't find any flaw. His faithfulness to the king is perfect. We can't find any flaw. But if there's one way to get Daniel to go against the king, it's going to have to be that we make the king sign a law that will cause Daniel to have to pick God or the king. Because if we can get the king to do this, we can pit the king's law against Daniel's God's law, and we know he'll pick serving his God first. That's a testimony. They knew what Daniel would do. They knew that Daniel would pray when they told the king to sign the edict. And we'll get into more about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. So then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto the king, King Darius, live forever, all the presidents of the kingdom. You stop right there. Do you notice what they said? All. They lied. No big surprise. Daniel was the key president, and he wasn't included in the all. All the presidents of the kingdom and governors and princes and counselors and captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask petition of any god or man for 30 days, save thee, O king, he shall be cast into a den of lions. So on the face of it, they lie. They say all the presidents and princes have gotten together, and this is a great idea, Darius. And on the face of it, it looks like they have his well-being in mind, and an arrogant pagan king would be like, yeah, that's a great idea. I love it. Nobody can make any request. The language that they use, shall ask a petition of any man or any god for 30 days. They only had to do 30 days. They didn't have to make it a long period of time. They knew Daniel would pray. They knew Daniel would make his petition to God. They knew that before they talked the king into this. Verse 8. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing that it be not changed. And in the Medo-Persian legal system, anything that had been signed in a law, even the person that signed it in the law couldn't change it. Even the person that signed it couldn't change it. It's not the first time we've run into this in the Old Testament. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing that it be not changed. Once you sign, it can't be changed. According to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. That's a great idea. I like it. They're looking out for me. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, I'm in verse 10, he knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. 2 things. They knew Daniel prayed regularly. That was something that he had established, and they knew that. And they knew that he would, when forced to choose between God and the king, he would choose God, and he would continue to pray. By the way, why was this so important? Go with me to 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 6. And the Lord brought this to my attention this week as well. 2 Chronicles 6. And at first I want you to notice the first 4 verses. And that just sets, again, the context. Then said Solomon, the Lord hath said that he would dwell in thick darkness, but I have built a house of habitation for thee, a place for thy dwelling forever. And the king turned his face and blessed the whole congregation of Israel, and all the congregation of Israel stood. And he said, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who hath with his hands fulfilled that which he spake with his mouth to my father David, saying, and what we have is Solomon dedicating the temple. Solomon's temple was a wonder of the world. And he was here in 2 Chronicles 6 dedicating that temple. Now start reading, let's pick it up. It's a lengthy dedication, but I want to pick it up in verse 36. And we're still kind of picking up in context, but bear with me and it'll start to come into focus. In verse 36. If they sin against thee, for there is no man which sinneth not, and thou be angry with them, and deliver them before their enemies, and they carry them away captives unto a land far off or near. So Solomon is in the process of dedicating the temple, and in the process of that, he recognizes that they're not perfect, and there may be a time when God takes them into captivity, and they're not able to get into their temple in person. Yet if they bethink themselves in a land whither they are carried captive, and turn and pray unto thee in the land of their captivity, saying, we have sinned and done amiss, and have dealt wickedly, if they return to thee with all their heart, and with all their soul, in the land of their captivity, whither they have carried them captives, and pray toward their land, which thou gavest unto their fathers. So, in the process of Solomon dedicating the temple, he said, now in the course of time, sin may occur. God may take you out of your land and put you in captivity. In the course of time, if you end up in captivity and you can't formally come to the temple of God that He's dedicating, if you can't go to Jerusalem and observe in the temple personally, he said, wherever you are, pray toward their land. Face the direction of the temple, which thou gavest unto their fathers, and toward the city, which thou hast chosen, and toward the house which I have built for thy name. So Solomon is saying, and of course, Daniel is very aware of the writings that would have been even in their infancy state of this time. And Daniel knows the words. If you can't get to the temple, pray in the direction of the temple. Now, that's the true holy land. That's the true holy land and holy place to them. In the New Testament times, I don't see that significance because we're able to assemble in our various houses of the Lord that are here, there, and everywhere. But in this day, when there was one temple, and if you couldn't get there because you're in captivity, face the temple and pray. And what did Daniel do? 3 times a day. Face the temple and pray. And they knew that. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they knew Daniel would serve his God, even if the king threatened lions. So back in Daniel chapter 6, he signed the unchangeable decree. And Daniel, verse 10, knew that the writing was signed. And he went into his house, whose windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem. He kneeled upon his knee 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. This was the characteristic of Daniel. And they knew that. Then, verse 11, these men assembled and found Daniel praying. Why, looky there. Daniel's praying. And they just stumbled across the fact that Daniel was praying 3 times a day. They were obviously spying on him. They assembled and found Daniel praying, making supplication before his God. He's making his petition before God. He can't do that. The king signed an unchangeable decree. we've got him. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? So they don't come out, they don't lead with, hey, we saw Daniel praying. They lead with, you signed a law, right? Why, yes, I did. The thing is true. The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Yes, I did. What's your point? Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee. They throw that out. It's like an old playbook they just keep using. That Daniel, that Hebrew, king, he never was a good Chaldean or now a Mede. He's still an old Hebrew. And we really hate those guys. And he's one of those of captivity. He's been kind of hanging around forever. And he regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day to his own God. Then, I love this, verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. He had been duped, and he knew it. He had been tricked against an individual that he had an enormous amount of respect for, and he knew it. He was displeased with himself. I think in part he probably knew the nefarious nature of these guys, and that he let himself fall for what they offered. Whatever it was specifically, he was displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel, still using his Hebrew name, to deliver him. What does the king do? He can't change the law, but he set his heart on figuring out a way to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Jump down to verse 20. I think that's where I want to be. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions. That's all he wanted, was Daniel to be delivered. And he obviously, verse 16 is the verse I wanted. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel, and they cast him in the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. This pagan king knew enough about Daniel's God that he knew, Daniel, Jehovah's got this. Daniel, you'll be fine. He's still a little nervous and he can't sleep. And then we read in verse 20 where he rushes in to see, is it true, Daniel? Did your God deliver you? And Daniel, of course, says yes. And it's interesting what he does, what the king does in the end of all of that to those that accused him. We'll get to that, Lord willing, next week. But I want to encourage each one. And it's been a challenge to me. It's been challenging to me to think about. Let us shine wherever God has us. Wherever that is. In the workplace, or in the community, or in our neighborhood, or in homes raising children, or wherever, in school, wherever the Lord has an individual, He's not necessarily calling us to change that place. Daniel was not called to make pagan kings Hebrew-like. Daniel was called upon by God to be the best Hebrew he could be in a pagan environment. Jesus said it like this: they are to be in the world, but not of the world. You and I live in the world, but may it be by the grace of God that we're not of the world. And that for our testimony. Not that we're going to kind of earn some kind of points with God and increase our favor with God. He deserves our best. And notice the confidence of the king in the God of Daniel, who he doesn't even know. There's no indication that Darius knows the God of Daniel. He just knows Daniel. And he knows the reputation and the testimony and the character of Daniel. And he's convinced Daniel's God is what has made Daniel like he is. May we be that convincing in our lives. May we have an excellent spirit in our lives, in our character, in our reputations, in our workplaces. May we seek to make our bosses look good and never do anything to diminish or cause damage. May we shine wherever God has us, that God may be properly reflected, that God may be exalted in the understandings of even lost people. Look how God was exalted in the understanding of Darius. May God work in our lives to bring that kind of reflective grace to our God in heaven. Because He's worthy of that. He's worthy of all of it. May God give us the grace to be that wherever He has us. And not one child of God is exempt from this duty. Not one child of God is exempt from this responsibility. Every one of us, wherever He has us. May that, here in the middle of the work week, may that challenge us and cause us to go into the rest of our work week striving to be the best that we can be, shining brightly for the Lord, and that for His glory. Let's stand.